On my wedding day, my wicked mother-in-law humiliated me in front of my entire family. "You are just the landscaper's daughter," she sneered. "My son could have anyone at his level, not a starving nobody like you who doesn't belong in our world." But what she never imagined was what would happen months later. Imani Thornwood smoothed the folds of her simple wedding gown. Her hands trembled as she looked at her reflection in the mirror of the small church dressing room where she'd been left to get ready. The white fabric was soft, but it wasn't silk or high-end designer. It was a dress her mother had sewn with dedication and love. "This is enough," she told herself over and over. But deep down, the weight of the difference between her world and Elias Amesworth's world crushed her heart. She couldn't help but recall the looks of contempt she'd received from his family over the last few months. Her father, Marcus, a strong man with hands hardened by years of work on the land, peeked through the doorway. His smile was proud, but his eyes showed a slight worry. "You look beautiful, baby girl," he said, entering slowly so as not to wrinkle his shirt. A bit worn, but clean. Imani gave him a faint smile, grateful for his attempt to reassure her. She knew her father had done his best to support her, even with the doubts he carried, too. But how could she feel secure when Elias's parents, seated among the guests outside, simply didn't accept her? Her love for Elias was undeniable, but the reality they faced felt heavier every day. "Thanks, Dad," she replied, taking his hand affectionately. "But I can't stop thinking about what's about to happen out there." Marcus sighed, moving closer and putting a hand on her shoulder. "The only thing that matters is that you two love each other. Everything else, well, everything else you'll figure out together." Imani nodded, though she couldn't block out the biting words that Randall and Vivian Amesworth, Elias's parents, had tossed around more than once. "She's just the landscaper's daughter," Vivian had said, as if it were a life sentence. "He could have anyone, someone on his level," the family's friends murmured. But Elias had never wavered. He always defended her. He always chose her. That commitment kept her strong, even as those voices of scorn echoed in her head. The sound of the guests starting to settle outside the church told her the moment was near. Her heart raced, and she took a deep breath, trying to calm down. Marcus, sensing his daughter's nervousness, squeezed her hand once more. "Elias loves you. That's all that matters today." Imani smiled, her eyes tearing up with emotion, and nodded. She knew it was true, but she couldn't ignore the weight of the stares she would feel once she crossed those doors. Outside, Elias stood at the altar, trying not to show his own anxiety. He knew what was coming. He knew what his parents, especially his father Randall, had planned. Randall had been explicitly clear in private. "Marry that girl," he'd said, his voice deep and controlled. "And you are signing your departure from this family. You will be disinherited, Elias. There will be no turning back." The warning still resonated in his head. Vivian, his mother, more diplomatic but equally calculating, had tried to dissuade him more subtly. "Elias, you can have everything you've ever dreamed of," she'd said softly, "but with her, it will be a difficult life. She's not your equal. She doesn't understand our world. Don't let this mistake ruin your future." Elias, however, couldn't be swayed. He loved Imani and knew that what they shared was authentic, much more genuine than any superficial relationship his family would have wanted for him. He knew that money and power couldn't replace what he felt for her. Still, the pressure from his family hounded him like a shadow. When the church doors opened and Imani appeared in the doorway, all those thoughts vanished. Elias saw her, and nothing else mattered. She was his anchor, the reason he was willing to defy everything. Imani walked slowly toward him. The shimmer of tears in her eyes reflected the mix of emotions they both shared. In the front row, Randall looked at his son with coldness. Vivian, with an expression of resignation, held her head high, but her disdain for the bride was obvious to everyone around her. Imani felt her steps were heavy, but when her eyes met Elias's, something inside her calmed. There he was, her sanctuary, her love. It was so palpable that she could forget the people looking at her with judgment disguised as polite smiles. When she reached the altar, Elias took her hands in his, squeezing them gently. "We're in this together, Imani," he whispered. She nodded, barely containing her tears. She knew what came next wouldn't be easy. The pastor began the formalities, but before he reached the crucial moment of the vows, Randall stood up from his seat. The murmurs among the guests intensified. Elias frowned, knowing his father wouldn't pass up the opportunity to make his final statement. "Excuse me, Pastor," Randall said, interrupting the ceremony's rhythm, "but I feel it is my duty to ensure everyone here understands what is happening today." The confused pastor paused and looked at Elias for a signal, but Randall didn't wait for a response. He addressed the guests, his voice clear and authoritative. "Today, my son Elias is marrying Imani, the landscaper's daughter. I am not here to insult anyone, but to make clear what this means for our family." The whispers grew louder as glances directed towards Imani, some of sympathy, others filled with judgment. "Elias has decided to ignore everything we have done for him, everything we have built together as a family, to marry a woman who is clearly not on his level." Imani felt the air escape her lungs, but before she could react, Elias let go of her hands and stepped forward. "That's enough, Dad," Elias said, his voice firm and filled with contained anger. Randall didn't seem affected by his son's words. He looked at him with a coldness only those closest to him knew. "I'm sorry, son, but if you choose to go ahead with this, you will be relinquishing your inheritance, your place in the family, everything. There will be no going back." The room fell silent. The guests held their breath, waiting for Elias's response. Everyone knew this moment would change everything. Elias stood motionless in front of his father, feeling the weight of his words fall upon him with crushing force. The room, which had been full of whispers and glances, now seemed an unfathomable void where only Randall's words resonated. "You will relinquish everything." Imani beside him looked on with her heart in her throat, her eyes shining with uncertainty, waiting for him to look at her, to reassure her somehow. But in that moment, all Elias could feel was a mix of rage and pain. Randall, still standing, observed his son with a cold, calculating gaze, as if to remind him who held the power in that room. But what he didn't understand was that Elias had already made a decision long before that day. "Dad," Elias finally said, his voice low but firm, "I know what this means to you. I know what you expected from me, what you always wanted me to do. But this is my life, and I am choosing Imani because I love her, because I know that with her I can be happy." Randall frowned, as if those words held no value for him. "Love, you say?" His voice was laden with scorn. "Elias, love doesn't fill bank accounts. It doesn't open doors. It doesn't give you the respect you need to keep building an empire. Do you really think that with her by your side, you can have the future we've prepared for you?" Vivian, Elias's mother, remained seated, watching the scene with an expression of resignation, but not without a small spark of sadness. She knew there was no turning back, and although she wanted her son to make a decision that benefited the family, she couldn't help but feel the pain this was causing. "Randall, please," Vivian whispered, trying to soften the atmosphere. "This isn't the time for this." But Randall didn't listen. He was determined that his son understand the price of his decision. Elias, clenching his jaw, looked his father directly in the eyes. The silence in the room was deafening. Every person present held their breath, aware that what was happening was not just a family conflict, but a silent war for Elias's soul. "I don't need your money or your respect to be happy," Elias continued, his voice growing firmer. "I've realized that what you offer me is a gilded cage." He turned toward Imani, taking her hand gently. "She offers me freedom. She is all I need to feel complete." Hearing those words, Imani felt tears threaten to fall. Elias had always been her rock. But in that moment, as he faced his own father for her, she understood the true scope of the sacrifice he was making. The love he professed was not superficial or fleeting. It was a promise of a life, a future together, even if the circumstances were against them. Randall clenched his fists, clearly frustrated by his son's lack of obedience. Since Elias was a boy, he had envisioned a glorious future for him, full of success and power, controlling the family company and taking the name to new heights. But now, all that effort seemed to be crumbling before his eyes because of a woman who, according to him, had nothing to offer. "You are making the mistake of your life," Randall spat out, looking at Elias as if he were observing a stranger. "This woman will lead you to ruin, and when that happens, don't expect us to lend you a hand." The cruelty of those words made Imani lower her head, but Elias didn't let himself be affected. He squeezed Imani's hand tighter, determined not to let his father break the love they had built with so much effort. "Then I won't have to return," Elias replied with serenity. Although his heart pounded fiercely, he added, "If living with her means losing everything else, then I accept it." Randall shook his head slowly, as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing. He took a step back, dropping the microphone, clearly defeated in his attempt to control the situation. The room remained silent, but this time it wasn't because of the tension between father and son, but because of the astonishment of the guests at what they had just witnessed. It was rare to see someone like Elias so openly defy his powerful family. Finally, it was Vivian who stood up. She walked toward her son with eyes full of contradictory emotions. She had hoped things wouldn't come to this point, but there was nothing more she could do. She stopped in front of him, looking at Imani for a brief moment before turning back to her son. "Elias," she said softly, with contained sadness, "you know what this means for your future, don't you? You know we can't go on if you choose this path." Elias looked at her, knowing those words came from a mother who loved him, but also from a woman trapped in a world of unbreakable expectations and rules. "Yes, Mom," he replied in a softer tone. "But this is the future I want. Imani is my family now." Vivian nodded, saying nothing more. She knew her son had already made his decision, and as much as it pained her, she wouldn't fight anymore. She gave a sad look to her husband, who had already returned to his seat, defeated in his attempt to control the situation. When Vivian returned to her seat, the ceremony continued, although the atmosphere remained charged with a strange, tense energy. Elias and Imani exchanged vows, both aware that their path together would not be easy. But as they held hands and looked into each other's eyes, they knew that what they had shared, what they had sacrificed, was worth more than any fortune or inheritance. "I love you," Elias whispered, as he placed the ring on her finger, his words filled with the promise of the future. Imani, her eyes full of tears, responded with a warm smile, one that made her feel that despite everything, they were in the right place. The ceremony ended amidst timid applause and some murmurs. The guests knew that what they had just witnessed was more than a wedding. It was an act of rebellion, a declaration of love that defied power and money. As Elias and Imani walked toward the exit together, hand in hand, they knew that although the road ahead might be filled with difficulties, they had already won the most important battle, choosing their own destiny, regardless of the cost. And crossing the threshold of the church, they realized that together they could face anything. The first few months after the wedding felt like a dream for Elias and Imani. Despite everything they had left behind, they had each other, and that seemed sufficient at first. The small apartment they rented in a modest neighborhood felt warm, filled with love and hope. Imani took care of decorating it simply, but with a personal touch that made every corner radiate her essence. Elias, meanwhile, worked tirelessly, seeking new opportunities to build their life together, away from the shadows of his family. However, that peace was fleeting. The first signs came when Elias began to notice that the doors that used to open easily to him were now closing in his face. Companies he had worked with in the past no longer took his calls. Meetings that had been automatic were now impossible to get. At first, he thought it was a coincidence, or perhaps the natural adjustment to having given up his family's support. But he soon realized that something more sinister was at play. One afternoon, after a failed meeting, Elias sat alone in a coffee shop, observing his reflection in the window. He felt defeated, as if the weight of his decision to defy his father was finally starting to take its toll. Then his phone rang. It was Trevor, an old family friend who had also worked at his father's company. Trevor's tone was solemn, almost compassionate. "Elias, I wanted to call so you'd hear it from me, not someone else," Trevor said, his voice low. "Your father has spoken to everyone. He's made sure that no partner, no reputable company offers you work. He's made it clear that anyone who supports you or Imani will be facing him." Elias felt his stomach sink. He knew his father was a powerful man, but he never imagined he would go this far. "Is he doing this for revenge?" Elias asked, although deep down he already knew the answer. Trevor paused, as if he didn't know exactly what to say. "It's not just revenge. He wants you back, but on his terms. He says everything can be fixed if you leave Imani and return to the family." Elias clenched his fist on the table, feeling an impotent rage rise in his throat. He knew his father saw everything as a power play, another strategy to control him. But this wasn't a business deal. It was his life, his marriage, his love for Imani. "That's not going to happen, Trevor. I won't leave Imani," Elias replied, his voice trembling with contained anger. "It doesn't matter what he does." "I know, but be careful, Elias," Trevor said in a graver tone. "He's determined to destroy any opportunity you have, and I think this is just the beginning." Elias hung up, feeling like the ground had been ripped out from under him. He knew facing his father would have consequences, but he never imagined they would go this far. Elias, a man accustomed to forging his own destiny, realized he was trapped in a web he couldn't control. He knew his father had the power to erase his reputation in the business world, and that was starting to destroy his chances of supporting his home. When he arrived home that night, Imani was waiting for him, as always, with a warm and concerned smile. But tonight, Imani's smile wasn't enough to lift Elias's spirits. He sat on the sofa without saying a word, his shoulders slumped and his gaze lost. "What happened, Elias?" Imani asked softly, sitting beside him. Elias looked at her, and for the first time in a long time, didn't know what to say. He knew she already felt the tension, that money was starting to run low and opportunities were disappearing. But telling her that it was all part of his father's plan made him feel even more helpless. "My father has made sure I can't work anywhere he has influence," he finally said, his voice flat. Imani looked at him in silence for a moment, assimilating what that meant. She knew Randall was capable of many things, but it was still difficult for her to accept that someone could do something so cruel, even to his own son. "And what does he want?" Imani asked, though she already knew the answer. "He wants me to leave you. He wants me to go back and do things his way, as always." Elias let out a bitter sigh. "He says if I leave you, he'll give me everything back, that I can have the life he always wanted for me." Imani felt a knot in her stomach. It wasn't the first time she had wondered if their love was destroying Elias's life. She knew he had lost everything to be with her, and though she had never said it, she feared that at some point that burden would be too much for him. But when their eyes met, she saw the same determination in Elias's eyes that had won her over from the beginning. "Elias, I can't ask you to keep losing everything for me," Imani said, her voice barely a whisper. Elias looked at her, astonished that she would even think that. He took her hand firmly, as if he feared his father's words could tear her away from him. "You're not asking me. I chose this. I chose you, and I would do it 1,000 times again." His voice cracked, but his gaze was firm. "I won't let him win. I won't leave you, Imani." Imani felt tears streaming down her cheeks, not from sadness, but from the love and strength Elias was showing her in that moment. But they both knew that the path they were on was uncertain, and that Randall's shadow would not stop pursuing them. The following weeks were even harder. Money began to run out, and with every door that closed, Elias felt more helpless. He looked for work wherever he could, but the rumors had already spread. Elias, the rebellious son, is blacklisted. Even in places where his family had no direct influence, his name had become synonymous with trouble. Imani tried to contribute what she could, but her skills and connections weren't enough to keep them afloat. One day, while Elias was sitting in the small kitchen, reviewing the few remaining work options, the phone rang again. This time it wasn't Trevor, it was his father. "You know, this doesn't have to be this way, Elias," Randall said, his voice smooth, but full of that cold authority he had always wielded over him. "Everything can go back to how it was. You just have to make the right decision." Elias gripped the phone, rage boiled inside him, but he tried to stay calm. "The right decision according to you, Dad, not according to what I feel. I'm not leaving Imani." Randall paused, as if evaluating the situation before continuing. "Very well, then let's continue this game. We'll see how much longer you can last with nothing. When you run out of options, you know where to find me." Elias hung up the phone, feeling more defeated than ever. He knew his father wouldn't back down, but he wouldn't either. However, the weight of the situation was beginning to crush him. Imani walked into the kitchen at that moment, seeing the look on Elias's face. "It was your father, wasn't it?" she asked with a mixture of worry and resignation. Elias nodded, unable to speak. He stood up, hugging her tightly. Imani nestled into his chest, and in that moment, they both understood that what was at stake was not just their love, but their ability to resist an implacable power that sought to separate them. But as Elias gently stroked Imani's hair, he realized something. His father could take everything from him except the most important thing. Time kept passing, and the difficulties seemed to multiply for Elias and Imani. Money was scarcer than ever, and work opportunities for Elias were vanishing at a relentless pace. But in the midst of that storm, news arrived that would change their lives forever. One afternoon, while Elias was out job hunting, Imani sat in the small bathroom of their apartment, holding a pregnancy test in her hands. Her heart pounded fiercely. The result was clear. She was pregnant. Mixed feelings swirled inside her. On one hand, the immense joy of knowing she was going to be a mother, but on the other, the fear of what that would mean amid the difficulties they already faced. When Elias arrived home, exhausted and his face pale from another unsuccessful day, he found Imani sitting on the sofa with tears in her eyes, but this time, not tears of sadness. Unsure of what was happening, Elias quickly approached, worried. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" he asked, kneeling in front of her. Imani took his hands and gave him a small, tearful smile. "I'm pregnant, Elias." For a moment, Elias's world seemed to stop. His mind tried to process what he had just heard. A child, a baby. Despite all the chaos surrounding their lives, that news filled him with a warmth he hadn't felt in a long time. Slowly, a smile spread across his face, and tears began to fill his eyes too. "Really?" he asked, his voice broken by emotion. "We're going to be parents?" Imani nodded, and in that moment, Elias hugged her tightly, both letting the tears of joy fall freely. For the first time in months, there was a ray of hope amid so much darkness. A child, that tiny being they hadn't even met yet, already gave them a new reason to fight. However, reality soon set in. With the baby's arrival, their needs would multiply, and they knew they had to find a way to get ahead and fast. It was then that Imani remembered one of the few talents she had always enjoyed, baking specialty cakes and desserts. Imani had learned to bake since she was a little girl, working alongside her mother in their modest home kitchen. It was something that made her happy and had surprised those who tried her treats on more than one occasion. At that moment, she thought that maybe this skill could be the answer they were looking for. "Elias," she said one night while they were having dinner, "I've been thinking, I could start selling cakes. I know it's not much, but if we sell them online, maybe we can earn some money." He looked at her with interest. He knew Imani's cakes were incredible, but it hadn't occurred to him that they could sell them as a source of income. "You think so?" he asked, although he could already imagine the idea's potential. "I could help you with deliveries, and we can create a page to promote them." Imani nodded enthusiastically, pleased that he agreed. That night, they stayed up late designing a plan. Elias, with his basic tech knowledge, created a simple page on social media where they could post photos of the cakes Imani would begin to prepare. For her part, she began experimenting with new recipes and decorations, wanting to offer something special. The first few weeks were slow. They sold a couple of cakes here and there, delivering them to local clients who found their page. Elias handled the deliveries by bicycle as they couldn't afford a car. At first, it wasn't much, but every time he returned from a delivery, he brought a smile with him. "People love your cakes," Elias would say excitedly. "Today, someone told me they're the best they've ever tasted." Imani, despite the fatigue from the pregnancy and the long hours in the kitchen, felt that they were finally finding a way to get ahead. With every order, her confidence grew. The small apartment kitchen had become a makeshift bakery workshop, with flour and sugar scattered everywhere and the sweet aroma of cakes permeating every corner. One day, while Elias was making a delivery to a regular customer, a man in a suit waiting at the entrance of a large building, he caught his attention. The man, who seemed to be observing the box of cakes Elias held with interest, approached him curiously. "Are those your cakes?" the man asked with a friendly smile. "They're my wife's," Elias replied with the same friendliness. "I just handle the deliveries." The man nodded, looking at the box carefully. "I work for a chain of coffee shops," he said, introducing himself as David, a manager for a major regional food company. "We're looking for something different to offer in our locations, and your cakes have great presentation. Would you mind if we sample them at our main cafe? If we like them, we could make a deal for you to supply us regularly." Elias was speechless for a moment. It was a real opportunity. After everything they had been through, could this be the turning point they so badly needed? "Of course," he finally replied, feeling the adrenaline in his body. "I can bring a bigger sample next week." When Elias arrived home that afternoon, he could barely contain his excitement. "Imani, you won't believe what happened," he said, rushing into the apartment. "A manager for a chain of coffee shops wants to sample your cakes. It could be a huge opportunity." Imani looked at him, surprised, her eyes wide. "Really?" she asked, as if she couldn't believe it. Elias nodded, hugging her tightly. "We're going to do it, Imani. This could be what we've been waiting for." That night, as Elias and Imani embraced in the small bed they shared, they felt more optimistic than they had in months. They knew the road would still be difficult, but now there was a possibility, a spark of hope that wasn't there before. And above all, they were doing it together. The following week, Imani prepared her best desserts, and Elias ensured the delivery was impeccable. They took them to the chain's main cafe, and David, the manager, was impressed, both by the quality of the product and the story behind them. A couple of days later, they received the call that would change their lives. "We love your cakes," David said. "We want to enter into a contract for you to supply us weekly." Elias and Imani couldn't believe it. For the first time after so much struggle and sacrifice, there was a real opportunity to get ahead. They were starting to build something of their own, something that no one, not even Randall, could take away from them. As Imani caressed her now more noticeable belly, and Elias watched her with a smile full of love and pride, they knew that despite all the difficulties, they had won the most important battle, choosing to stay together and facing everything life threw at them. And now, with the hope of a better future for themselves and their child. The months that followed the contract with the coffee chain brought a significant change to Elias and Imani's lives. Little by little, orders increased, and what began as a small survival venture grew into a booming business. Imani, with her increasingly prominent belly, spent long hours in the kitchen, creating new recipes and ensuring every cake was perfect. Meanwhile, Elias, always ready, handled deliveries, logistics, and began managing the accounts and contracts that arrived thanks to the growing popularity of the desserts. However, success didn't come without its own challenges. The work was becoming exhausting for Imani, and the pregnancy in its final trimester left her depleted. As the days advanced one afternoon, as she was bent over the counter decorating a cake for a new delivery, she felt a sharp pain in her back that forced her to stop. She took a deep breath, trying to calm down, but the pain didn't subside. Elias walked in at that moment with a large box of supplies in his hands, and seeing the expression on Imani's face, he immediately dropped everything. "Are you okay?" he asked, rushing over to her. Imani tried to smile to reassure him, but the pain wouldn't let her pretend. I think it's just the baby. He's restless today," she replied, although the discomfort was evident. Elias looked at her with concern. He knew that even though Imani was incredibly strong, he couldn't ignore the fact that her body needed rest. He knelt beside her, taking her hand gently. "Imani, you really should rest a bit. You've been working too hard," he said tenderly but firmly. She shook her head softly. "We have so many orders, Elias. We can't stop now. This is what's pulling us through." Elias stroked her cheek, his face reflecting the mix of love and worry he felt. "I know, but your health and the baby's health are more important than any cake. Let me take care of the rest for today. Please, rest." Imani finally nodded, realizing she couldn't keep ignoring her body's signals. Elias guided her to the sofa and helped her sit comfortably. Then he returned to the kitchen, determined to finish the order himself. That night, while Imani rested, Elias reviewed the finances and upcoming orders. The business was growing faster than they had anticipated, and while that was cause for joy, it also meant they needed to find a way to manage the workload. Hiring help would be the sensible thing to do, but they were still recovering financially and couldn't afford large expenses. The next morning, while they were having breakfast together, Imani took her cup of tea and looked at Elias, thoughtful. "I've been thinking," she said. "Maybe we should look for a small storefront." "A storefront?" he asked, looking up from the newspaper. "Don't you think that's a bit soon?" Imani smiled, her eyes shining with enthusiasm. "It's not too soon if we keep growing at this rate. We'll need more space. Plus, if we have our own place, we could hire someone to help me in the kitchen. We can't keep working solely from the apartment when the baby is here." Elias remained thoughtful for a moment. The idea of having their own storefront had always been a dream, but the circumstances of the last few months had kept him focused only on survival. However, hearing Imani speak with such hope, he knew that dream was closer than they thought. "You're right," he finally said with a smile. "Let's start looking. It won't be easy, but if we find the right place, we can take the next step." Imani returned his smile, feeling immense relief. Although the path until that moment had been difficult, now there was a new horizon full of possibilities. The following weeks were filled with excitement and nervousness. Elias handled deliveries and continued scouting for potential locations, while Imani, despite her advanced pregnancy, kept managing orders from home with the occasional help of a neighbor who offered assistance. Finally, one day, after weeks of searching, they found a small storefront downtown, right next to a popular cafe. It was modest, but it had everything they needed: a spacious kitchen, a customer service area, and a display window that could attract passers-by. The rent was fair, and with a little effort, they knew they could turn it into something special. "This is the place," Imani said excitedly, touring the space, already imagining how she would decorate it and how it would look filled with fresh cakes. "I can see it all, Elias. It will be our home away from home." Elias watched her, feeling a mix of pride and love. Despite everything they had been through, they were building something of their own, something no one could take away from them. "We'll make it happen," Elias promised, taking her hand. "This will be our next step." With the contract signed and the keys in hand, the renovations began. It was a slow process, as they were still managing orders while simultaneously preparing the space for opening. But with each passing day, the place transformed, and with it, their lives. One afternoon, while painting the walls of the new shop, Imani paused, her hand on her stomach. "I think the baby is excited too," she said with a smile. "He's moving around a lot today." Elias quickly approached, placing his hand on Imani's belly, feeling the small movements. "He's going to be a great baker, I can already tell," he joked, his eyes full of love. Imani laughed, but her laughter was interrupted by a small wince of pain. Elias looked at her, worried. "Are you all right?" She nodded, though the pain was evident. "I think it's just the baby settling, but maybe we should head home and rest." Elias didn't hesitate. He knew the last few weeks had been exhausting for both of them, but especially for Imani. They left the tools and returned home, knowing that while there was much to do, Imani's and the baby's health were the most important things. The business was on its way, the plans were moving forward, and the future was beginning to take shape. Every day, despite the challenges, Imani and Elias felt closer to achieving their dreams. They knew the road hadn't been easy, but they also knew they had walked it together, and that made them invincible. And even though the problems and shadows of the past were still present, the success they were building with their own hands was the best testament that love and perseverance could overcome even the highest barriers. Elias and Imani had been working tirelessly to finish the details of the new shop. Opening day was fast approaching, and although both were exhausted from the long days of work, there was a mixture of excitement and nervousness in the air. The dream of having their own business was about to become reality, but the pressure for everything to go well was starting to weigh on them, especially with the baby so close to arriving. One morning, as Imani finished organizing the display cases of the new space, she felt a sharp pain in her abdomen. At first, she thought it was just another pregnancy discomfort, but this time the pain was stronger, and a feeling of unease flooded her. She stopped, breathing deeply and leaning her hands on the counter, waiting for the pain to pass. Elias, who was outside reviewing some paperwork, walked in at that very moment and saw her leaning over, her face tight with pain. "Imani?" he asked worriedly, quickly approaching. "What's wrong?" She tried to smile to reassure him, but the pain wouldn't let her pretend. I think the baby is ready to come," she said, her voice trembling. Elias felt fear and excitement flood him at the same time. He knew the moment was near, but he didn't expect it to be so soon. "We need to go to the hospital," he said urgently, grabbing the keys and carefully helping Imani stand up. The trip to the hospital was a mix of tension and excitement. Imani breathed slowly, trying to stay calm while Elias drove with one hand on the wheel and the other holding hers. Every so often he glanced at her, trying to make sure she was okay, even though the latent fear in his chest made him feel helpless. Upon arriving at the hospital, they were quickly received by the staff, and Imani was taken to the delivery room. Elias, though anxious, stayed by her side the entire time. The hours that followed were long and exhausting. Elias had never felt such an intense combination of fear and emotion. As he held Imani's hand, he saw the effort and pain on her face, but also the incredible strength she demonstrated in that moment. The admiration he felt for his wife grew with every second. Finally, after what seemed like endless hours, the cry of a baby broke the tense silence of the room. Elias and Imani looked at each other with eyes full of tears of happiness and relief. The doctor lifted the baby, and as he placed her on Imani's chest, the room filled with a peace they hadn't felt in months. "It's a girl," Elias whispered, his voice broken by emotion. Imani, exhausted but radiant, looked at her daughter tenderly. She stroked the baby's soft skin, whispering words of love as tears rolled down her cheeks. Elias leaned in, embracing them both, and for a moment the entire outside world disappeared. They were a family. Hours later, when Imani rested with the baby in her arms, Elias left the room to get some air. Despite the joy he felt, he knew work still awaited. The shop was almost ready for the grand opening, but there were still a few details to sort out. As he looked out the hospital window, he thought of his father, of everything he had left behind, and how destiny had led them to this moment. The fight with his family, the closed doors, the daily struggles, it had all been worth it to get where they were now. However, his father's shadow remained, though distant. He knew Randall had tried everything to make their lives miserable, but what he hadn't been able to foresee was that the love he shared with Imani was much stronger than any influence or power his father could wield. But the doubt lingered. Was he truly free from his family? A few days after the birth of their daughter, whom they named Zuri, meaning beautiful in Swahili, a nod to their heritage, the shop's grand opening finally arrived. Imani, still recovering, managed the last details from afar, while Elias and some close friends helped prepare everything. There were balloons, flowers, and a simple but meaningful sign at the entrance: Zuri's specialty desserts. Opening day was a success. Neighbors from the area, regular customers who had tasted the cakes before, and some new curious patrons entered the small shop, drawn by the delicious aroma and the welcoming atmosphere. Elias and Imani couldn't believe it. After months of sacrifice, hard work, and obstacles, their dream had finally come true. However, in the midst of the joy and bustle of the opening, Elias noticed a familiar figure among the customers entering. Randall, his father, had arrived. Elias felt a knot in his stomach. He didn't know what to expect from him. They hadn't been in contact for months, and the last time they spoke, things did not end well. Randall, dressed in his impeccable suit, slowly approached the counter where Elias waited with a serious face. "Elias," Randall said with a voice that seemed less authoritarian than usual, "I wanted to see how you were doing." Elias looked at him, unsure if his father came with good intentions or if it was just another strategy to make him feel that he had failed. "We're fine, Dad," Elias replied calmly, though emotions churned inside him. "I don't need your approval." Randall observed him for a moment, and in his eyes, for the first time, Elias saw something he hadn't expected: weariness. His father, the man who had always been the figure of unbreakable power, looked older, more vulnerable. "I didn't come for that," Randall said, taking a deep breath. "I came because I've been thinking. Maybe I was wrong. I didn't expect you to get this far. And Elias didn't know what to say. His father's words left him stunned. For so long, he had fought to show that he could do it alone, without relying on the family fortune, and now, facing him, his father seemed willing to acknowledge it. "Don't get me wrong, Elias," Randall continued. "I still believe this isn't the path you should have taken." But his voice softened, something Elias had never heard in him. "But I can't ignore what you've achieved. I came to congratulate you, despite everything." Elias, still in shock, nodded slowly. "Thank you, Dad," he replied, not knowing what else to say. Randall stayed a few seconds longer, as if he wanted to say something more, but in the end, he turned and walked out of the shop without looking back. Elias watched him leave, and a sense of relief mixed with confusion washed over him. Maybe it wasn't the end of his problems with his father, but at least for the first time, there was a glimmer of reconciliation, however small. When Elias returned to Imani's side, she smiled at him, holding Zuri in her arms. "What happened?" she asked, noticing the look on his face. "My father came to congratulate us," Elias replied, still incredulous. Imani looked at him, surprised, but said nothing more. She just extended her hand to him, and as he took his small daughter in his arms, he knew that come what may, nothing could ever separate them again. They had built something real, something of their own. The morning sun streamed gently through the windows of the small bakery, illuminating the display cases filled with delicious creations that had made Zuri's specialty desserts a success in the city. It was a normal day, but for Elias and Imani, every day in that space was a reminder of everything they had achieved together, against all odds. Zuri, now several months old, lay in a makeshift crib in the back of the shop, giggling as she played with a small plush toy. Imani, with a look of love and serenity, worked in the kitchen, carefully decorating a custom cake for a frequent client. Elias was at the counter, serving customers with a smile that reflected more than just business satisfaction. It reflected peace, a peace he hadn't felt in a long time, After everything they had been through, from his father's threats to the moments of desperation when it seemed nothing would work, they had reached this point. They looked at each other and smiled, knowing that the most important thing wasn't the business's success, but the fact that they had built something real, something no one could take away. A family, a home, and a future full of promises. That afternoon, when the flow of customers began to slow down, Imani sat next to Elias, stroking the small hand of Zuri, who was sleeping peacefully. "Do you remember those first few days?" Imani asked with a nostalgic smile. "Everything seemed so uncertain, and now look where we are." Elias nodded, clearly remembering those days filled with uncertainty. They had so many doubts, so many sleepless nights, wondering if they could truly make it. But he also remembered the small victories, the moments when they felt they were moving forward, even when everything seemed to be against them. "It wasn't easy, but it was worth it," Elias replied, taking Imani's hand. "Every sacrifice, every obstacle, it all brought us here." Imani looked at him, seeing in his eyes the same strength and determination that had won her over from the beginning. Despite everything they had lost by defying his family, he never regretted his choice. He had chosen love, and that love had sustained them through the darkest times. "Sometimes I think about how things would have been if we had given in," Imani said with a touch of reflection in her voice. "If you had done what your father wanted, if I had let the pressure tear us apart." Elias shook his head gently. "We can't live thinking about what might have been. Everything we've been through has brought us here, and I wouldn't change anything we have. Look at Zuri," he said, pointing to their small daughter. "She's the proof that every decision was the right one." The silence that followed was one of peace, of a deep understanding between them. They knew their path hadn't been the easiest, but it had been theirs, the one they chose together. Suddenly, the shop door opened softly, and they both looked up to see Randall, Elias's father, enter slowly. The tension that would have been palpable in his presence before wasn't there now. On his face, one could see that something had changed in him too. He wasn't the same man who had tried to control his son's life and impose his wishes. Randall approached the counter, looking around the shop. His eyes settled on Zuri, who was still sleeping peacefully. "She's beautiful," Randall said softly, breaking the silence. "She looks like her mother." Elias exchanged a quick glance with Imani before nodding. He knew his father's words weren't just a compliment. They were a recognition, something he had never expected to hear. "Thank you, Dad," Elias said, approaching him. Randall took a deep breath, as if he were fighting with something he had held back for a long time. Finally, he let it out. "I was wrong, Elias. I was wrong about so many things," he said, with a tone of vulnerability he had never shown. "I thought that what I had was best for you, but I was blinded by my own pride. Seeing what you've built here, your family, this business, it makes me realize that money and power aren't always the most important things." Elias felt a heavy weight lift from his chest. He had waited so long to hear those words, and although he didn't believe everything could be fixed immediately, it was a step towards something better. "All I ever wanted was to be happy with Imani and my daughter," Elias replied, his voice soft but filled with conviction. "I wanted you to see that, to understand it." Randall nodded slowly, looking at his son with a mixture of regret and respect. "I see it now, and I regret putting you in the position I put you in. I'm not here to ask you for anything, just to tell you that I'm proud of what you've achieved." Elias felt tears well up in his eyes, but he swallowed them, staying firm. He extended his hand to his father, who, after a second of hesitation, took it. The gesture, though simple, was the beginning of something new. Imani, watching the scene, felt a peace she hadn't felt before. She knew Elias had carried the burden of his father's disapproval for so long, and seeing that reconciliation, however small, was a necessary closure for both of them. After Randall left, the shop filled with silence again, but this time it was a silence of hope. There was a new beginning, not only for Elias and Imani, but also for the relationship with the family he had left behind. "Do you think things will change from now on?" Imani asked as she rocked Zuri in her arms. Elias looked at her, reflecting for a moment. "I don't know," he replied with honesty. "But the important thing is that we are good, and that won't change. Everything else will come with time." Imani smiled, leaning her head on Elias's shoulder as they watched the sunset through the window. They had started with nothing, facing the greatest adversity they could imagine, but they had triumphed, not because they sought wealth or success, but because they had done it together, out of mutual love and trust. And in that moment, as they held their daughter and sat in their small business, they knew that true success was not material, but the family they had built. A family that, against all odds, flourished, proving that love and perseverance can conquer even the biggest challenges. The future was uncertain, but Elias and Imani knew that no matter what happened, they would keep moving forward, always together. And that was the greatest victory of all. Did you like the story, and which city are you listening from? Let's meet in the comments. If you like the story, you can support me by sending a super thanks so I can keep bringing more stories like this. Thank you so much for your sweet support. I'm looking forward to your comments on the story. On the screen, you can see 2 new life stories that I highly recommend. There's so much more on my channel. Don't forget to subscribe. See you in the next life story with love and respect.